Some of you know that last week I was in Iceland and just returned Friday evening. And I can't decide, how do you know the difference between jet lag and age? I mean, in terms of what's affecting you. Now, before I went, there were just three things that I knew about Iceland. First, it's cold there, which I guess is where it has something to do with their rather unimaginative name, Iceland. Second, I knew that they were hit particularly hard by the 2008 economic meltdown, and pun intended. And what happened was that all three of their major privately owned commercial banks went into default. So they really took a beating back then. And then third, I remember the 2010 volcano eruption, which caused enormous disruption to air travel across Western and Northern Europe for about 6 days. Now, because of the economic collapse in 2008 and then the volcanic eruption in 2010, the following joke was born. Quote, "It was the final request of the Icelandic economy that its ashes be scattered across Europe." I didn't make that up. So that's what I knew about Iceland. This week I learned two really interesting things about Iceland. Number one, 55% of Icelandic people believe in elves. I think the Lutheran Church is sort of falling down a little bit in their responsibilities. The second interesting thing is about, has to do with their carbon footprint in Iceland. On the one hand, their carbon footprint is very high due to air travel, and of course most that's related to tourism and the need to get away from the cold weather by the locals. And also they produce a lot of metal, so that caused a big, really high carbon footprint. But on the other hand, almost all of their energy is produced by geothermal power. And so heating their homes and businesses and using electricity produces almost zero carbon emissions. Now, that's not always been true. In the not too distant past, they left a very big carbon footprint due to the use of fossil fuels for their energy needs, and there are many of them because they need to heat their homes all the time. But once they discovered that they could do something that was less expensive and more environmentally friendly, then they made a complete turnaround. And it's really been a beautiful thing. We learned all about it. To quote a famous computer scientist from the 20th century, Rear Admiral Grace Murray Hopper, she said, "The most damaging phrase in the English language is, 'We've always done it this way.'" Now, if computer scientists and Icelandic scientists and any other old scientists use that as their mantra, right? We've always done it this way. Well, there will never be any progress whatsoever. I've always wanted to preach a sermon about that phrase. We've always done it this way, or rather against that phrase. But of course, there needs to be good reasons. We don't want to change things just for the sake of change. There has to be good reasons for doing something different, such as what we're doing now. Is it working? Or we think we can do better than what we're doing now, because it is insane to keep doing the same thing over and over again that's not working. Some of you may have read my Ferguson Times article this month that just came out, where I referred to Albert Einstein's definition of insanity, which is, as you know, doing the same thing over and over again and expecting different results. And I relabeled this definition of insanity, Einsanity, in honor of Dr. Einstein. You may use that freely. The number one reason for doing something different is when the world in front of us is nothing like the world behind us. Now, such was the case with the Lewis and Clark expedition that I've been talking about during Lent that began in May of 1804, right over here in St. Charles. After, you know the story, after 15 long, grueling months of traveling upstream on the Missouri River, the Corps of Discovery, as they were called, realized that the world in front of them was nothing like the world behind them. They had followed a small trail up a creek, and now they were at the spring that was the source of the Missouri River. And Meriwether Lewis was excited, and he wanted to savor the moment, so he reached down, he took a drink of water out of the stream. And because of his intel, he was convinced that he would merely walk up to the top of the hill in front of him, and he would see the Columbia River on the other side. And this river, he believed, would take them swiftly downstream to the Pacific Ocean. He could not have been more disappointed. In front of him was not a gentle slope down to a river, but the Rocky Mountains, stretching out for miles and miles as far as his eyes could see, one set of peaks after another. Isn't life like that sometimes? Just when you think, I've got it all figured out, it's all downhill from here, you run into the Rocky Mountains, whatever that might be. And the same is true for congregational life, for the life of the church. Congregations, I've learned, often operate as if the world in front of them is exactly the same as the world behind them. And we know for a fact that is not true here at Immanuel, do we not? So we've always done it this way. That's no longer an appropriate phrase that we can use freely in this church or really any other church today. The biblical writers, the storytellers, they understood this great truth. For example, the prophet Isaiah, we heard from him a few minutes ago. He remembered a time when his ancestors ran into their own Rocky Mountains, so to speak, which was a large body of water. Remember, they're trying to get away from the Egyptians, where they'd been living for hundreds of years, and in front of them was the Red Sea, right? And the story that he remembers featured the parting of the Red Sea and the destruction of the Egyptian army so they could get away. And so Isaiah writes, just kind of rehashing this memory, "Thus says the Lord, who makes a way in the sea, a path in the mighty waters, who brings out chariot and horses," the Egyptians, of course, "army and warrior. They lie down, they cannot rise." They were stuck in the mud. "They are extinguished, quenched like a wick." Well, here they are now, centuries later, and Isaiah and his people, they're in a very similar predicament. They've been in a foreign land for a long time. They've been in exile in a place called Babylon for several decades. But thank goodness the Persians decided they would conquer the Babylonians. And they did. And they said to all the people that the Babylonians had captured and all that, said, "You can go home now. You're free to go." Which is great. But now in front of them is this great, expansive Arabian desert that they're going to have to cross before they can get home. So what do they do? How do they do this? This is their version of the Rocky Mountains, right? Just right in front of them. And they can't rely on the desert to just part like the Red Sea so they can safely go across. They can't rely on, we've always done it this way to help get them home. They have to find a new way. In fact, Isaiah sort of alludes to that when he says, "Do not remember the former things," what I'm talking about here, "or consider the things of old. I, God, am about to do a new thing." And this new thing will have to address the situation that now confronts them. It's a whole new scenario, and God's got to help them figure it out. Okay, so here you are. You're about to have to cross a big, expansive desert. What are some things that you might have to worry about as you make your way across that desert? Well, I think three things in particular. Number one, water and food, or lack thereof, is a concern. Number two, you need to find a way to get there, a clear path to get home. You got to know what direction you're going and all that. And number three, there potentially will be wild, dangerous animals. So Isaiah, using the voice of God, addresses all three of these concerns. God says, This is my new thing, okay? Forget what happened with the Red Sea and all that. This is my new thing. First, he says, now it springs forth. Do you not perceive it? And I think this is a clear reference to springs of water and maybe even food that would grow in the desert sort of naturally, right? So God is basically saying, I'm going to provide water and maybe some food. And then he says, I will make a way in the wilderness. And, again, to reiterate, rivers in the desert. So this is a clear reference to a path, a clearly designated path to go home. And, of course, he mentions water again, which is the most important thing you're going to need going through a desert. And then finally, God, through Isaiah, says, the wild animals will honor me, the jackals and the ostriches, for I give water. There it is again, water in the wilderness, rivers in the desert, to give drink to my chosen people. Well, this is interesting. I thought maybe he's saying that the wild animals will be a little nicer to these travelers if there's plenty of water and food out there. They won't have to attack these people. And so they'll be able to make their way safely. Now, despite Isaiah's optimistic words, I'm sure it was a very difficult journey home for the Israelites in the late 6th century BC. But I think Isaiah's point is very clear. When the world in front of us is different than the world behind us, we can't rely on the saying, well, we've always done it this way. The Apostle Paul, he understood this on a personal level. In his letter to the Philippians that we heard a moment ago, he talks about how he could always rely on his credentials as a bona fide Israelite, as someone who was righteous under the law. That's all he needed. That was in his passport. That's all he had. That was good enough. But then one day, he discovered that the world in front of him was not the same as the world behind him. Here he is walking down the Damascus Road, and he hit his own Rocky Mountain experience in the spirit of Jesus Christ. Jesus was his Rocky Mountains. And because of his encounter with Jesus, Paul understood that he needed to change course, and he needed to take a very different route, or walk a very different path, a path of righteousness rooted in faith, rather than a path of righteousness rooted in obedience to the law. He knew that he could no longer claim, I've always done it this way, once he discovered a better way. And he drives his point home when he says, Beloved, I do not consider that I have made it my own. In other words, this is not what he did. But this one thing I do, forgetting what lies behind, that is his old credentials and doing what he always did, forgetting what lies behind and straining forward to what lies ahead, I press on toward the goal for the prize of the heavenly call of God in Christ Jesus. Paul didn't just discover a new path to travel. He discovered a whole new way of traveling. So as individuals, as a congregation, we need to be very clear about something today. We've always done it this way is never, never, never a good reason for not doing something different when the world in front of us is not the same as the world behind us. And it's not. Therefore, whether at home, work, school, play, or at church, if anyone within 3 feet says to you, we've always done it this way, you should consider tackling them hard, because you might just save them from a severe case of insanity. Amen.